Imagine opening your phone to a text that rips the ground from under you. Sold your empty building. We needed cash. No discussion, no respect, just a cold message from my own brother. To him, it was an empty shell. To me, it was the last living reminder of my father's work and the sacrifices that shaped our family. For those of us past 60, we understand legacy isn't about walls or bricks. It's about holding on to the pieces of history that tell us who we are. That betrayal wasn't just financial. It was personal, a wound to trust and memory itself. But what Conrad failed to see was that sometimes the very act meant to erase your worth becomes the trigger for justice. Before I reveal how everything turned against him, take a moment to like and subscribe. Not just for another story, but to remind yourself why protecting legacy, wisdom, and dignity matters. Each tale here is proof that time and truth are always on the side of the patient. My name is Silas Montgomery. I'm 62 years old, a retired postal worker living in Ohio. For nearly 4 decades, I walked the same neighborhoods, carried the same bag, and knocked on the same doors. That job didn't make me rich, but it taught me discipline, reliability, and how to find pride in small, steady work. When you've lived long enough, you realize life isn't about flashy success. It's about the little legacies we protect, the ones our parents left behind. For me, that legacy was a plain brick building downtown. People passed it every day without giving it a second glance. My siblings mocked it, called it worthless, even told me to let it go. But I couldn't. Every year, while they rolled their eyes, I quietly paid the property taxes, kept the paperwork in order, and held onto the deed like it was a lifeline. Why? Because that building wasn't just property. It was history. It was where my father taught me responsibility as a boy. I remember sweeping its floors during summers when my friends were outside playing ball. I remember watching him count pennies at a worn wooden desk, reminding me, Silas, value doesn't always shine on the surface. You've got to look deeper. To outsiders, it was an empty shell. To me, it was a classroom of life lessons, a reminder of the man who worked himself to the bone so his children wouldn't go without. As the years passed, my siblings grew impatient. They said I was foolish to hold onto a money pit. But there's something seniors know well. Worth isn't measured only in dollars. Sometimes the real value of a place is what it preserves inside you. That building held my father's voice, my mother's laughter echoing in its walls, and my own youth carved into its corners. Walking away would have felt like walking away from them. So I endured the ridicule. I clipped coupons, stretched my pension, and kept writing those tax checks because deep down I believed there was a reason. Seniors like me often talk about gut feelings, that quiet wisdom you earn after 60 years of mistakes and victories. My gut told me that one day this decision to hold on would matter. And it did. When betrayal struck, when my brother sent that cruel text claiming he had sold what wasn't his to sell, it wasn't just about property. It was about him trampling on everything I had preserved. That's why the pain cut so deep. But here's the lesson I want every senior listening to remember. The world may dismiss what you hold dear, but never underestimate the power of patience, memory, and loyalty to your roots. Sometimes the very thing others laugh at you for protecting becomes the one thing that saves you in the end. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when life feels almost ordinary. I had just settled into my chair with a cup of tea, the television humming in the background, when my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was a reminder from my pharmacy or maybe a message from one of my old coworkers. But when I opened it, my heart sank. It was from my younger brother, Conrad, a man I had trusted my whole life. The message was short, cold, and final. We sold it. We needed cash. That was it. No greeting, no apology, not even an explanation. Just 7 words that ripped apart decades of sacrifice and responsibility. For a moment, I sat frozen, staring at the screen, hoping I had misread it. How could my own brother, flesh and blood, take the building that had been left in our father's name and sell it without so much as a conversation? Seniors understand this kind of moment, when trust, carefully built over a lifetime, crumbles in an instant. The betrayal doesn't just sting your pride, It reaches into your chest and twists something you thought was unshakable. I called him immediately, my hands trembling, my voice barely steady. When he answered, there was no remorse. Instead, I was met with arrogance. Conrad laughed lightly, as though my anger was nothing more than a child's tantrum. "It's not like you ever used it, Silas," he said casually. "You should be grateful we turned it into something useful." Grateful. Imagine being told to be grateful while someone steals from you. That word burned more than the act itself. At that moment, I felt a wave of isolation wash over me. My siblings had always been quick to dismiss me as the cautious one, the sentimental one. I could already hear their voices echoing behind Conrad's. It was just an empty building. He was never going to do anything with it. For seniors listening to this, you know the feeling of being underestimated, of people assuming that because you've slowed down with age, your judgment or your values no longer matter. That's the kind of dismissal that cuts deeper than words. I hung up that phone call with my chest tight, my pulse hammering. For hours, I walked the small rooms of my house in silence, the words repeating over and over in my head. We sold it. We needed cash. That wasn't just a property. It was my father's lesson in brick and mortar form. It was the echo of his sacrifices. And now, it was gone, sold off by someone who valued quick cash over family legacy. That evening, I sat by the window and asked myself what any senior might ask in a moment like that. What was all my patience for? What was the point of holding on when no one else cared? The answer didn't come that night, but here's what I know now. Betrayal has a way of revealing the true measure of people. Sometimes those who smile at you are the same ones who would sell your legacy for pennies. And sometimes the pain of that discovery is the very spark that pushes you to reclaim your dignity. For every senior who's been dismissed, taken advantage of, or told to be grateful, while others strip away what matters, remember this. Betrayal is often the first chapter, not the last. And what feels like the end may just be the setup for justice. After Conrad's cold words echoed in my ears, the first thing I did was reach out to the rest of my family. Surely, I thought, someone would understand the weight of what had been stolen. Surely, at least one of them would see this for what it was, a betrayal, plain and simple. I called my sister, Evelyn, hoping she might soften the blow. Instead, her response was clipped and dismissive. "Silas, you should be relieved. That building was a burden. Conrad did what had to be done." Her words stung almost as badly as his message. I tried another brother, Martin, thinking maybe he'd be the voice of reason. But he, too, stood behind Conrad. "It's just property, Silas. Don't make this bigger than it is. You're retired now. Why not enjoy your life instead of clinging to old bricks?" That was the moment I realized I was standing alone against them. It wasn't just Conrad's decision. They all shared in it. Family, the very people you expect to protect you, had closed ranks against me. For those over 60, you understand the peculiar loneliness that comes when those you thought would have your back suddenly leave you stranded. It's not just the loss of support. It's the realization that the voices you trusted for years can turn cold when money enters the picture. I sat at my kitchen table that evening with the phone in my hand, scrolling through contacts, feeling like each name on the list was another door that would slam in my face. But then I saw one name I hadn't thought of in years, Miriam Ellsworth. Miriam had been my neighbor for nearly 3 decades before her husband passed. At 70, she carried herself with the quiet grace of someone who had seen storms and survived them. I dialed her number, unsure if she'd even pick up. To my surprise, she answered on the second ring, her warm, steady voice instantly breaking the silence that had wrapped around me. I told her everything. Conrad's text, Evelyn's dismissal, Martin's indifference. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I braced myself for another dismissal, but instead, she said something I'll never forget. "Don't lose hope, Silas. Sometimes what looks like a loss is just the setup for justice." Her words struck deeper than any consolation I had heard that day. Miriam wasn't sugarcoating the pain. She wasn't pretending everything would magically fix itself. Instead, she offered something more powerful: perspective. Seniors like us understand this kind of wisdom. When you've lived long enough, You know, life rarely unfolds in straight lines. Sometimes the worst days carry the seeds of the greatest turnarounds. That night, I replayed her words again and again, the setup for justice. It reminded me of all the times in my postal days when a storm would delay deliveries. People would grow anxious, upset, even angry. But eventually, the mail always arrived. Justice, too, has a way of finding its route, even if it takes longer than we'd like. I went to bed that night still wounded, but no longer defeated. I realized that even when family abandons you, there are people, true friends, quiet allies, who will step in and remind you of your strength. For seniors listening to this, I want you to take this lesson to heart. Betrayal isolates, but it doesn't have to imprison you. When the ones closest to you turn their backs, don't forget to look around. Sometimes the support you need comes from unexpected corners, a neighbor, a friend, or even a stranger who sees your worth when others refuse. Isolation can break you if you let it, but if you listen closely, it can also reveal who's truly in your corner. Miriam's voice, steady and kind, became the first thread of hope in a day otherwise filled with despair. And little did I know, her words would become a prophecy, because justice was already on its way. That night, after hanging up the phone with Miriam, I sat in the silence of my small living room. The house felt heavier than usual, as though the betrayal had seeped into the walls themselves. The easy response, the one bubbling in my chest, was rage. Part of me wanted to storm over to Conrad's house, slam my fist on his table, and demand answers. I imagined shouting until my throat went raw, demanding back what was mine. But even as those thoughts raced through my mind, I knew something deeper. Anger is loud, but it is also short-lived. Rage burns bright, then fizzles, often leaving the person who carried it even more broken than before. I leaned back into my chair and remembered Miriam's words. Sometimes what looks like a loss is just the setup for justice. She was right. Justice doesn't come from shouting matches or quick decisions. It comes from patience, strategy, and letting truth reveal itself at the right moment. Seniors know this better than most. We've lived long enough to understand that time itself is a weapon. And at 62, I knew I had something Conrad lacked, the discipline to wait. So instead of rushing into a fight, I made a vow to myself that evening. I whispered it out loud, as though saying it would cement it into stone. If Conrad thought I was weak, he had no idea how patient I could be. That sentence wasn't just defiance. It was a promise to my father's memory, to the sacrifices that had built that building brick by brick. The next morning, I began to carry myself differently. I didn't chase my siblings for explanations, didn't call back to argue, didn't beg them to see my side. Instead, I pulled back. I blocked Conrad's number from my phone. I deleted the message so I wouldn't torture myself by rereading it. It was symbolic, me cutting the chain that had tied me to their arrogance. If they believed I was powerless, I would let them sit with that belief, unaware that I was quietly gathering strength behind the scenes. Here's the lesson I want every senior listening to take away. Sometimes silence is not surrender, it's preparation. When people wrong you, their first expectation is that you'll explode because that reaction gives them control. But when you stay calm, when you pull back and observe, you shift the power dynamic. You stop being their victim and start becoming their reckoning. In those days that followed, I walked daily around the block, letting the cold Ohio air clear my head. I spent evenings reading, journaling, even revisiting some of my old postal work habits, organization, meticulous note-taking, quiet observation. It felt almost like training, sharpening my mind and patience for whatever storm would come next. Each small routine was a reminder that I wasn't powerless. Yes, I had been betrayed. Yes, my family had turned against me. But I hadn't lost everything. I still had my integrity, my resilience, and my ability to wait. And waiting, as I would soon learn, is often the most powerful form of action. Because while those who betray you spend their energy scrambling, lying, and covering their tracks, patience ensures that their downfall comes not by your fury, but by their own hand. By choosing patience over rage, I stepped onto a path that would eventually bring me not just justice, but peace. And though Conrad couldn't see it yet, the very silence he mistook for weakness would become the sharpest weapon I'd ever wield. In the weeks after Conrad's betrayal, the grief hung over me like a shadow. I had moments where I'd wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, replaying that message in my mind. We sold it. We needed cash. Each time, it stung like a fresh wound. But here's something you discover when you've lived over 60 years. You can't sit forever in the ashes of disappointment. At some point, you have to choose, do I let this break me, or do I use it to rebuild? So, I began the slow work of transformation. I didn't throw myself into grand gestures. Instead, I started with small steps, the kind seniors know well. I volunteered at the local senior center twice a week, setting up tables, serving meals, and listening to stories. It might sound simple, but that work grounded me. It reminded me that pain is easier to carry when you help someone else carry theirs. On Saturdays, I signed up to mentor kids at the community library. Sitting across from a 12-year-old struggling through fractions, I'd catch myself smiling. The very patience I thought was my weakness became my greatest gift. The kids didn't know my story, but they gave me something priceless in return, purpose. And that purpose began to rebuild the confidence betrayal had stolen. Still, part of me knew I couldn't stop there. Conrad's theft had taught me a harsh truth. Ignorance makes you vulnerable. I had trusted others to handle the complexities of property law, deeds, and inheritance documents. That trust had cost me dearly. So I decided to do something I never imagined at my age. I enrolled in night classes at the local community college. Sitting in a classroom surrounded by students young enough to be my grandchildren wasn't easy. But every lecture, every chapter on land records, tax assessments, and inheritance statutes felt like sharpening a blade I'd one day need. The breakthrough came when I befriended a retired professor who taught part-time. His name was Harold, a wiry man with bright eyes who carried himself with the calm authority of someone who had lived through decades of courtroom battles. One evening, after class, I stayed behind, confessing how my brother had betrayed me and how powerless I had felt. Harold looked at me, then said words I'll never forget. Knowledge is the sharpest blade. Use it, and you'll never feel powerless again. Those words became my mantra. I poured myself into studying. I learned how to trace deeds back through generations, how to file the right claims in the right offices, and how to spot the kind of loopholes that greedy relatives exploit. I carried a small notebook everywhere, jotting down terms and lessons like a student again. For the first time in months, I wasn't just surviving, I was equipping myself. Here's the lesson I want seniors to take from this. Growth doesn't end at retirement. Age doesn't mean you stop learning. It means you finally have the perspective to learn what truly matters. Whether it's a new skill, a new subject, or even revisiting something you thought you'd never use again, knowledge has the power to restore what betrayal tries to take away: your sense of control. In the mirror, I saw a different man emerging. Not the Silas who had been blindsided by a cruel text, but the Silas who was slowly, patiently arming himself with wisdom. Every volunteer shift, every mentoring session, every page of property law brought me closer to strength. And though Conrad believed he had stripped me bare, what he had really done was awaken a version of me far stronger than the one he betrayed. The man who once thought of himself as just a retired postal worker was now something else entirely. A student of justice, a quiet builder of resilience, and someone who understood that the best revenge isn't in shouting, but in growing so steady and sharp that no betrayal can ever break you again. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon at the senior center. I had just finished stacking chairs after lunch when a retired gentleman named Arthur struck up a conversation with me. Arthur wasn't just any senior. He had spent 40 years as a real estate lawyer before hanging up his suit and tie. He was the kind of man who carried knowledge like a second skin, sprinkling facts and insights in a casual talk as though they were weather updates. He asked me about my week, and I hesitated before admitting that I'd been betrayed by my younger brother over a family property. Arthur raised his eyebrows and with a thoughtful hum said, "You know, that sounds familiar." I could have sworn I saw a property like that in the redevelopment section of the local paper. He excused himself, dug into his worn leather satchel, and pulled out a folded newspaper. There, on the front of the business section, was an article that nearly knocked the wind out of me. The headline read, "City redevelopment plans spark multi-million-dollar appraisals." And right beneath it was a photo of the very building Conrad had called worthless. My eyes darted to the appraisal figures listed. $8.5 million. $8.5 million for the same property my brother had dismissed as nothing more than bricks gathering dust. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. My heart raced, my palms sweated, and my throat felt dry. It wasn't just the shock of the number. It was the realization of what it meant. Conrad hadn't sold an empty shell to help the family scrape by. He had robbed me of a fortune, knowingly and deliberately. He had looked me in the eye, shrugged off my years of loyalty to that building, and taken what he assumed I was too blind to see. Outrage coursed through me like fire. I thought back to every tax check I had written. Every year, I had sacrificed small comforts to keep that property afloat. Every moment, my siblings mocked me for holding on to something useless. And now I knew the truth. They weren't ignorant. They were greedy. They had seen the city's plans. They had known its worth. And they had decided to cut me out of the future my father intended for me. For seniors listening, you know the depth of betrayal when money exposes true character. It isn't just about the dollar figure. It's about trust, dignity, and the years you can't get back. At 62, you realize that fortunes aren't just financial. They're built on integrity, on the promises you thought family would never break. When those promises are shattered, the wound is deeper than any bank account can measure. But here's the twist. That discovery didn't crush me. It sharpened me. Because once you know the truth, you hold power. And while Conrad believed he had silenced me with his arrogance, he had, in fact, awakened something he couldn't control. The patient, steady man he had underestimated was now armed with evidence, clarity, and an outrage that would no longer be contained. Arthur looked at me that day, his expression kind but firm, and said, "You've been wronged, Silas. But don't let them write the ending to your story. That property, that legacy, it still has your name written all over it. Don't you forget that." In that moment, the betrayal transformed into resolve. I realized Conrad hadn't just stolen money. He had ignited the very fire that would one day ensure he faced the justice he thought he could outrun. Seniors, here's the lesson. The truth may take its time, but when it comes, it doesn't whisper. It roars. And when it roared for me, it carried a number, $8.5 million. That changed everything. Months passed after Arthur had shown me that article, and during that time, I carried the truth like a secret weapon tucked close to my chest. I didn't tell Conrad the first knew. I didn't confront Evelyn or Martin. I simply went about my life, volunteering, studying, and quietly preparing. Outwardly, I was the same old Silas they thought they had brushed aside. Inwardly, I was sharper, stronger, and waiting for the right moment. Then one chilly autumn morning, as I was sipping coffee on my porch, my phone buzzed again. I almost didn't answer. It had been months since I had blocked Conrad, and any contact from him now came as a surprise. This time, however, it was a message request. The words were short but frantic. "Silas, they want to build over the land, but the title is still in your name. We need you to sign." For a moment, I stared at the screen, stunned. The very brother who had treated me like a nuisance, who had dismissed my years of sacrifice, was now admitting the one truth I had quietly known all along. They couldn't move forward without me. Despite all their arrogance, all their betrayal, the power still rested in my hands. I could almost hear his voice behind the words, less confident now, less mocking. This wasn't the Conrad who once laughed at me for being sentimental. This was Conrad cornered, realizing too late that his scheme had holes he couldn't patch. Greed had blinded him to the very detail that now held him hostage. The title was in my name. My patience had outlasted his trickery. For seniors listening to this, there's a powerful lesson here. Life has a way of circling back. The very people who once treated you as powerless may one day find themselves needing what only you can provide. Age doesn't strip you of influence. Sometimes it makes your position even stronger. Patience and endurance, the qualities we're often told are old-fashioned, are the same ones that turn the tables in our favor. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I let the message sit there, unanswered like a weight on his conscience. Hours passed. Then another message came. Please, Silas, we can work something out. Just sign the papers and you'll get your share. Share? The word itself made me laugh out loud. My share had been stolen months ago. My share had been mocked, diminished, and treated as worthless. And now, suddenly, it was valuable again because they were desperate. That night, I lay in bed and reflected on the irony. For so long, I had felt powerless, isolated, dismissed. Yet here I was, holding the one card they couldn't play without me. It was a turning point, not because I had sought revenge with fury, but because I had waited long enough for their lies to fold in on themselves. When I finally crafted my reply, it was measured, deliberate, and calm. You called it worthless, Conrad. Remember? You said I should be grateful you made it useful. So no, I won't be signing anything. You'll have to live with your decision. The silence that followed was louder than any argument we had ever had. For the first time, I realized I wasn't chasing justice anymore. I was living it. And here's where the wisdom lies for every senior. The strength you build in silence, the dignity you preserve when others try to strip it away, becomes the very foundation of your power later. Don't underestimate yourself just because others do. Sometimes the sweetest victory comes not from shouting or striking back, but from knowing that the tables will eventually turn. And when they do, you'll be the one sitting firmly in the seat of control. When Conrad's second message came through, dripping with desperation, I knew the moment had arrived. This was the man who had once mocked me for clinging to dead bricks, now begging for the very signature that only I could provide. I didn't rush my answer. Instead, I let him stew in silence for a full day, imagining the panic spreading through his chest as developers grew impatient, as contracts slipped, as the walls of his greed closed in on him. When I finally replied, my words were simple, deliberate, and sharp enough to cut. You called it worthless. Now live with your choice. My pen will never touch those papers. That sentence wasn't just refusal. It was the culmination of months of betrayal, years of sacrifice, and a lifetime of being underestimated. It was justice boiled down to a single truth. He had made his decision, and now he would have to choke on it. At first, Conrad tried arrogance again. Silas, stop being stubborn. This can benefit all of us. But when I didn't bend, his tone shifted. Apologies trickled in, weak and hollow. I'm sorry for how it happened. We should have included you. Let's just fix this. For years, I had dreamed of hearing an apology from him. But when it finally came, it was nothing more than desperation dressed up as remorse. Seniors understand this. Real apologies don't come when someone is trapped. They come when someone is free to choose humility. And Conrad was anything but free. Soon, promises followed. He dangled money in front of me, offering percentages, shares, even cash under the table if I would just sign. But money was never what bound me to that property. My father's legacy couldn't be bought with hollow promises, and my integrity wasn't for sale. Every offer he made only confirmed how deeply he regretted underestimating me. When the money failed, Conrad turned to manipulation through others. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in months called me out of the blue, urging me to be reasonable. An old cousin said, "Silas, you don't want to tear the family apart over this." I almost laughed. The family had been torn apart the moment Conrad sold what wasn't his to sell. His plea through them was nothing more than a weak attempt to use guilt as a lever. My response never wavered. Each time, I repeated the same quiet sentence. You made your decision. Now it's mine to keep. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself, and I didn't explain. I had learned by then that repetition is its own form of power. While Conrad scrambled, changing his approach each time, I remained the immovable stone in the river. His desperation washed against me, but it couldn't move me. And here's the lesson for every senior. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the calm, steady refusal to be manipulated. People will try everything, guilt, promises, even threats, to bend you to their will. But when you hold your ground, you show them the true weight of resolve. At 62, I no longer needed their approval, their excuses, or their money. What I needed was dignity. And dignity comes from knowing when to say no and mean it. Conrad thought betrayal would make me weak. Instead, it made me unshakable. And with every unanswered call, every ignored plea, and every cold refusal, I wasn't just reclaiming my power. I was teaching him the one lesson he had never learned. Choices have consequences, and greed always collects its debt. It didn't happen overnight, but karma has a way of showing up right on time. As the weeks turned into months, the developers who had been circling that property like vultures grew impatient. They wanted signatures, clean titles, and legal clarity. But without my approval, none of it could move forward. Conrad and his partners tried to bluff their way through, but paperwork doesn't bend to arrogance. Contracts stalled, deadlines expired, and eventually, the developers packed up their interest and walked away. The million-dollar deal Conrad had bragged about behind closed doors evaporated into thin air, leaving him with nothing but empty promises and angry investors. The collapse didn't just bruise his ego, it crushed his finances. Lawyers had to be paid, filings redone, and taxes that Conrad assumed would be someone else's problem piled up in his name. What he had seen as easy money became a mountain of debt. Slowly, the man who once sneered at me for being sentimental was reduced to begging creditors and dodging calls. Every corner he had cut, every dishonest word, came back as a bill he couldn't pay. Meanwhile, my patience paid off in ways even I hadn't anticipated. With Harold, the retired professor and mentor I'd met in class, guiding me, I began filing the right claims. We traced the inheritance records back to my father's will, documented the years I alone had covered the taxes, and presented clear proof that the property had always been mine by right. Piece by piece, the legal foundation Conrad thought he had destroyed was rebuilt, this time stronger than ever. Within months, the courts recognized me as the sole legal owner of the property. But justice didn't stop at restoration. It delivered dignity. Shortly after regaining full rights, I was approached by the city council. They had plans to redevelop the neighborhood and asked if I would consider donating a portion of the land to build a new community center. It felt like a full circle moment. A building my father once called our family's cornerstone would now serve generations to come. Without hesitation, I agreed. The groundbreaking ceremony was small but heartfelt. Seniors, children, city leaders, all gathered to celebrate what the community center would mean for the neighborhood. As I stood there with the mayor at my side, shovel in hand, I couldn't help but glance at the crowd. And there he was, Conrad, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast, his arrogance gone. He had no applause left to offer, no smirk to hide behind. He was simply a man forced to watch as the brother he tried to strip of everything was honored in front of the very community he had betrayed. The mayor's voice rang out. Today, we thank Mr. Silas Montgomery for his generous contribution. Because of his vision and resilience, this space will no longer be a forgotten lot, but a beacon for our future. The applause that followed wasn't just for me. It was for the justice that had unfolded. Here's what I want every senior to take from this. Life may hand you betrayals that cut deep, but patience and integrity always outlast greed. You don't have to chase revenge with fury. Sometimes, the sweetest justice is simply standing tall while those who wronged you crumble under the weight of their own choices. That day, as the first shovelful of dirt was lifted, I felt the presence of my father beside me. The building Conrad had mocked became more than bricks or dollars. It became a legacy. And for the first time in a long time, I stood not as a victim of betrayal, but as proof that karma, though patient, never misses its mark. In the end, my brother's betrayal didn't destroy me. It defined me. What Conrad thought was his greatest victory became the spark that lit my transformation. He believed he had sold my future for pennies, stripping me of legacy and dignity. But instead, his greed handed me the best revenge of all: freedom, self-respect, and a legacy that will outlive every selfish choice he ever made. That worthless building, he laughed, it was never worthless. It was the cornerstone of my family's story. And when karma revealed the truth, it came with an $8.5 million price tag that he could never touch. I walked away from that storm with more than a legal victory. I walked away knowing who I was. Betrayal can shake your trust in others, but it doesn't have to shake your trust in yourself. Seniors especially understand this. The world may try to tell us we're too old to fight back, too late to start fresh, or too weak to make a difference. But patience, the kind of patience you only earn after 60 years of living, is the most powerful weapon we have. Where younger people rush and stumble, we wait, we watch, and we endure. And in the end, that endurance always pays off. So if you've ever been dismissed, ignored, or underestimated because of your age, let this story remind you. Strength isn't always in fists or fury. Sometimes it's in silence, in consistency, in holding steady while others burn themselves out with greed and lies. Karma never misses, and it always finds its way back to those who thought they were untouchable. Conrad's downfall wasn't my doing, it was the natural consequence of his own choices. All I had to do was stand firm and let time do the work. And here's the truth I hope every senior carries with them after hearing this. You are never powerless. You're never too late. And you're never too weak to protect what is yours, whether it's your dignity, your peace, or your legacy. If anything, your age gives you the clearest advantage, because you know that rushing leads to ruin, but patience leads to justice. If this story spoke to you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Epic Karma Tale. Not just because it helps the channel, but because every time these stories are shared, they remind someone out there, young or old, that justice still exists and betrayal never has the last word. Stay with us, because the next tale will leave you speechless.